Well, good evening, and thank you all very much for coming tonight, giving your evening up for Somalia. A fascinating country, and one in which we perhaps don't hear as much as we would like, and there are reasons for that, of course, and that's partly why we're here tonight to discuss that. We're going to be looking really at what's happening in the country now, why it is we hear so little about it, what are the dangers there, particularly not just for local people, which obviously is the most important, but also for journalists wishing to cover the country. And the three of us have all been there, in my case quite a short period, which I was told was advisable. But obviously this presents problems when you're trying to accurately tell people what's happening in a country if you can't go there for very long for security reasons. And here with me we have Colin Freeman, who's Chief Foreign Correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph. And we also have Mary Harper, who's the BBC's Africa analyst.
Good evening.
I'd like to actually start with Mary, if I may. We know that since 1991 there's been no stable national government. We've had an interim government, transitional government, but stable is not the word I would use to describe it. Mary, can you tell us what's happening at the moment? How stable or how unstable is Somalia?
Somalia is very unstable at the moment, as it has been really for the past almost 20 years. It's been without any central functioning government. And at the moment, there's a new president who has just been elected, and he's appointed a government. But basically, if you think of Somalia, it's a pretty big country, and he only controls and is able to govern just a tiny part of the capital city. And the rest of the country is being fought over by lots of different groups, and is at the current moment controlled by, a lot of it is controlled by a rather extreme Muslim group called Al-Shabab, which is imposing quite an extreme form of Islamic law on a lot of the country.
And Mary, just how many groups are there? Because one of the things I planned to do the last time I was there was to fly into Mogadishu, and I was warned that by people on the ground there that would be dangerous because there are so many different groups. And the one group that offered to look after me said, the trouble is to get to us, you've got to get past lots of other groups. How many are there?
You can't really put a number to the number of groups that there are in Somalia, because Somalia is it's divided into a series of clans, and each of these clans is divided into a series of sub-clans, sub-clans, and it keeps on fragmenting down. And sometimes these clans are allied with each other, other times they fight against each other. And then you have these various Islamist groups that have formed, and Islamist armies, and then more moderate Islamist groups. So it's impossible to put a number in terms of the clan, in terms of all the different divisions.
People may have heard of the Islamic courts that were there previously before the Ethiopian army came in. Would you say back then, despite the adverse publicity that this group attracted, particularly in America, that in fact things were at least a little more stable then?
Yes, what's quite incredible is that for 6 months in 2006, central and southern Somalia did enjoy a sort of paradise period where people could go out in the streets without being in fear of their lives. They could shop normally. There was some sort of normalcy for people, but at the same time the Western world at least saw this group of Islamic courts as a real threat, and so they basically backed Ethiopia to get rid of them. So in some ways you could say that the United States policy is responsible for destroying this 6 months of peace in Somalia.
Now, for journalists going to the country, obviously this presents a whole host of difficulties. And Colin, can you tell us about your visit there? Because you planned to go there for 6 days for the Sunday Telegraph and landed up staying quite a bit longer, didn't you?
Yes, we went back in November of last year, ostensibly to do a story about the piracy problem, which is another of the many difficulties facing Somalia on top of the insurgency and the Islamist challenge and so on. We went to a place called Bosaso, which is in the northern part of Somalia. Bosaso is an area called Puntland, which is a kind of semi-independent province which broke away in the 1990s as a way of trying to separate itself off from all the trouble and the civil war that was engulfing the country at that time. It's slightly better organised and slightly safer than the rest of Somalia, but that is all relative, of course. And they do have a particular problem with the piracy there. partly because they have a very long 1,500-mile coast, which is not very well policed and fundamentally not very easily to police either, because there are virtually hardly any roads there. We went there to do a story about the piracy problems, and we ended up meeting some pirates ourselves, basically. On the last day of our journey, of our trip to this town, Bosaso, our convoy was travelling back to the airport, and the group of bodyguards that we'd hired to protect us. Nearly every journalist who goes to Somalia has to hire bodyguards. They suddenly turned on us and they kidnapped us and whisked us off out of town and up into the mountains into to a cave, or a series of caves, where we were then held for about the next 6 weeks, eating mainly goat meat and rice and smoking cigarettes, which meant I lost a lot of weight. But it's not the way I would recommend anyone to meet pirates firsthand.
Did you have any inkling at all before this happened of what was about to take place?
If you go somewhere like that, you know that there is always a risk that kidnapping will take place, hence the bodyguards. What you hope is that the bodyguards will protect you rather than the other way around. It is always a risk, and as we got driven away, my thoughts were really, well, this is the sort of thing that happens to people who go to places like Somalia or Iraq these days. You're preconditioned to it to a certain extent, so it wasn't quite as shocking as you might expect.
I assume you must have had moments there, Colin, where you were thinking, why am I here? Why did I do this?
Yes, the first thing that goes through your mind after the initial shock of what's happening, and you've got a bearing on what's going on, really is what a fool I've been. Why did I come to this country just because I thought I was a big macho foreign reporter, and it's going to cause my girlfriend and my family and everybody at work so much problems and hassle, this, assuming they can get me out of here. Why on earth did I allow myself to drift into this profession? It was such a stupid, selfish thing to do. And I know other people who have been in similar situations, I think, have kind of said the same thing. All of a sudden, it seems like a big mistake.
And did the kidnappers communicate with you in any way? Did they explain why they'd done this, or was it just really for money?
We don't really know. I mean, kidnapping in Somalia, like in Iraq and other places, there are all manner of motives that they do it for. Sometimes it's criminal, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's a mixture of both. Sometimes they say it's one when it's the other, and vice versa. So I'm not really quite sure. We think it was a variety of different things. It's also often done to embarrass the authorities in the place wherever you're going, because if word gets around that this particular part of Somalia is not safe for foreigners to visit, then it suggests that whoever's running it can't run the place properly, and therefore their chances of attracting foreign investment or any kind of foreign capital into the country are very limited. But in terms of communication with the guys we were with, they spoke very, very little English. We spoke no Somali. The only mutual language was Arabic, which I speak a little bit of. And really, though, it didn't go much further than water and cigarettes and things like that. And occasionally, we would speak the international language of football. One of them was a big Arsenal fan, and on about the second day, he said to me, "Are you English?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "England, Manchester United." Michael Owen, and I said yes, and then he said also Thierry Henry, and I said yes, Arsenal, and he said no, Barcelona. And I checked with my colleague who had also been kidnapped with me, and he said yes, Thierry Henry transferred to Barcelona last year. So there is always that international language of football, even amongst the kidnappers of the mountains of Somalia. But otherwise, no, not an awful lot of conversation, which was a shame really, because it would have been interesting to have been able to speak to them and would have helped pass the time, if nothing else.
And how did it come to be full time, if you'll give the expression there? When was the 90 minutes up, and how did that happen? It
was after about 6, I think we did 40 days and 40 nights or 39 nights. It would have been more convenient if it was 40, really nicer, rounder figure. But And then eventually, we'd been in sporadic contact with people in London who were sort of trying to negotiate our release. There were a whole load of people trying to negotiate our release in Somalia as well, politicians, NGO people, other journalists. I've met all manner of people who have since said, oh yeah, I was making calls or whatever. Some of them I think are probably just saying that, others probably who maybe did pull real strings have kept rather quieter about it. Eventually we got a phone call saying, right, well, you should be going home tomorrow or the day after. We'd had a few false alarms like that before, so we didn't take it too seriously, but on this occasion the leader of the kidnap gang, his demeanour was very different. He said, yes, or he said, tomorrow you'll go, in Arabic, and he smiled for once, which he didn't do very often, and at that point we figured something, was about to happen.
Really pleased that you managed to make it back, Colin. I understand that in 2008, according to the UN, 35 people were killed in Somalia. That's 35 aid workers, and 26 abducted. Mary, what's the commonest motive for this?
I think the most common motive is money, and then the reasons why people want money are different. Some people want money to buy weapons. Other people, it's become a way of life for lots of people in Somalia, not just on land, but at sea as well. If you think that they've hijacked dozens of ships off the coast of Somalia, and they don't want to kill the people on the ships. The crews of the ships are very, very precious to them alive, because if they're kept in good health and alive, they get better ransom payments, and these ransom payments are up to about $3 million per ship. So really, because it's very difficult to make money in Somalia by sort of normal channels that we think of. Kidnappings, abductions have become a real fashion amongst young people who want to earn money, and it's easy because most young men in Somalia have a gun or something more sinister in terms of weapons. So it has become it's become an economy really in Somalia.
And reporting all this can be very complicated, can't it? Mary, you were reporting on what had happened to a particular ship that had been hijacked, and then the people on it kidnapped, and you were speaking to the people who'd been kidnapped, and then the Foreign Office said they didn't want this broadcast anymore because it was interfering with negotiations with the kidnappers. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. What happened basically was that I'd been trying to get through to the crew and the pirates on this ship for a long time. I became obsessed with trying to ring them, and I'd even put the number on my mobile phone. And one afternoon I was actually driving my daughter back from a party, and she'd seen me trying to call the pirates. So she said, look, can I try and call the pirates for you? And I was like, no, of course you can't, don't be silly. And then as the traffic jam went on for longer and the rain beat down harder, I eventually gave in, and I sort of threw the phone back, and I said, okay, call them. And she managed to actually have this conversation with the pirates on the ship, and she told them that it was her mother worked for the BBC and she wanted to speak to them. So the following day, with the help of my colleagues in the Somali Service, we called them, and we managed to speak to both the pirates and the crew on board the ship. And then I wrote a story about how I had managed to get through to the pirates, which was broadcast on from our own correspondent. And according to senior people at the BBC, this encouraged lots of other people to call the pirate ship as well. And so it apparently interfered with these very delicate negotiations that were going on between the Saudi authorities and the pirates on board the ship. This is what they said anyway. So it caused a kind of diplomatic incident, and the BBC saw fit to withdraw the programme, which was broadcasting my piece, because they said it was interfering with negotiations.
Did the kidnappers ever talk to you? Did you hear what they felt about their newfound fame? All these people trying to ring them up, or at least trying to ring up the people they'd kidnapped anyway?
No, I didn't speak to them after that, but I think they used to get quite fed up actually with people trying to call them, because they had other things to do when they were on board the ship. And I think it was really thanks to the Somali Service that they did agree to speak to me and to the Somali Service, because They weren't really very interested in becoming famous, actually. I think they just wanted to get their money and go. But what happened to them in the end was that they did get their money, but then most of them drowned when they were sailing back to Somalia because they hit a storm. So most of that money went to the bottom of the sea.
Colin, you've been looking as well at this whole issue of piracy. We've now got a couple of large Japanese ships heading to the region with the idea of trying to deter anyone attacking Japanese craft. Just how common is the piracy now in this area?
It's very common. I think there's something, I can't remember the statistics offhand, but there was something like about 100 boats were taken last year. And the difficulty is that no matter how many warships you put in, these, American, Japanese, and British frigates and so on, it's a vast ocean that you're talking about. And even the Gulf of Aden, which is a relatively narrow channel, it's still impossible for large naval vessels to police it properly. And there are, at any one time, there are always lots of small boats belonging to local craft in the area. It's very difficult to tell which one is a pirate vessel and which one isn't. And they only need a window of 15 minutes to actually get on board a ship. And once they're on board, there is nothing that a British Navy frigate can do, because they then got control of the ship. So you can have a situation where you've maybe got a naval ship, maybe 2 miles from a ship that it's supposed to be protecting. If a small vessel, if they don't see that a small vessel coming up to the target ship in the necessary time, then there's nothing they can do. It's a real problem, and everybody I've spoken to who is involved in shipping or whatever, none of them really seem to have any idea of how the problem is going to go away. And as long as there is continued lawlessness in Somalia itself, and that the pirates can go back to where they come from with impunity.
Yeah, some of these ships that they're hijacking are enormous, aren't they? They're really, really big ships and have their own security. And it seems startling that they're unable to protect themselves. But presumably these pirates must have some very sophisticated weaponry.
I don't think they do really. I mean, they have rocket-propelled grenades. If you hold a rocket-propelled grenade at a large tanker or something like that, full of oil and gasoline and other potentially combustible items, most ships' captains are not going to say, "Well, come on then, let's see how it, let's see the colour of your money." Also, the fact that the ships are enormous, so, the average oil tanker can be a quarter of a mile long, doesn't mean to say it's got a huge amount of crew on it. It may have no more than about 25 or 30 crew. A lot of the time, they have no particular interest in laying their lives down to save the ship either. And the other difficulty is that for the ships, when a group of people get on board, which is again not that difficult, they just use a grappling hook and a ladder. Once they're on board, they're then in the situation where they either pay a ransom quickly and get the situation dealt with, or they can allow things to drag on for months and months and months. Every day that a ship is inactive and being held, the ship owners run up enormous bills, $50,000 a day, sometimes more, and it very quickly becomes easier simply to pay a ransom straight away. And that is one of the problems that then encourages the ransom paying, encourages the pirates, and you get this vicious circle.
Yet we have a country, Mary, where most people, of course, despite the high-profile image of pirates and bandits and kidnappers, presumably are not kidnapping people or shooting at people. What are they doing? How are they surviving?
Well, for the Somalis who haven't left, and lots and lots of Somalis have left. Some have moved far away. You have Somalis living in Australia, America, Europe, lots of them living in other African countries like Kenya as well. But for the Somalis that are unable to leave, because basically in the worst affected parts of Somalia, everybody wants to leave or to fight. And those are the people that really are suffering most, and especially around the capital, Mogadishu. about a third of the population, 1 million people, have left, and a lot of them are living in the most horrific conditions, basically on a road outside Mogadishu in these camps. But because it's so dangerous for aid workers to work there, they're getting very little outside help. And the United Nations has described this really as the world's worst humanitarian disaster. And one problem is that because it's so dangerous for journalists to get there, nobody can even go and tell their story. So they're like it's like a forgotten nightmare, and that's mainly women and children who are really, really suffering.
Do you have any idea how many international aid staff are there? I know from my own experience, my short time there, that there were none at all. I mean, all the people I met were local, working for agencies like World Vision or whatever, but they weren't international staff. Do you know how many international staff are in Somalia?
I don't know the exact number, but for the few that are there who sort of go in and out, it's very, very dangerous. I mean, just today we had 3 international staff and 1 Somali working for the United Nations were abducted as they were on their way to an airport to get out of Somalia. They just dropped in and they were abducted. So that's how dangerous it is for them, especially the ones working in the southern and central parts. So it really is. It's even difficult to get food into Somalia because of the pirates, and the people there are you could almost say that they're abandoned.
Now, someone working for the World Vision charity told me that it was now at the point where he felt it was pointless bringing aid into Somalia because people were hijacking it and then selling it off and then buying guns with it. And even if aid agencies checked that people had it, they would find in the evening when they'd left, these men would move in and take it off them. So are we at a point where even if aid comes in, it's actually getting to the people that need it?
Yeah, that is definitely a problem, and you hear those stories time and again in the camps for displaced people, that armed groups, criminal gangs, or sometimes people allied to some of the different groups fighting for control of parts of the country will go and set up roadblocks and basically take the food that is meant for these poor civilians, and then either, as you say, they sell it for weapons or they use it to sustain themselves. But at the same time, you can't just give up on Somalia. Nobody is within Somalia is going to help these people. So I do think that the international community has a responsibility to try to help the people that are stuck there. But as you say, they are faced with an almost impossible situation.
Colin, I assume you've been keeping a close eye on Somalia since your awful time there. The place has suffered, the country suffered, and the whole region, the Horn of Africa, suffered from a very bad drought, and hunger is a big problem, isn't it? So presumably without the aid workers, things must be getting pretty dire.
Well, certainly anywhere that begins to harbour a big culture of kidnapping foreigners effectively cuts itself off from the international aid donation system quite quickly. And you've seen that in Iraq, and you've seen that in Afghanistan, and it then also means that people are unable to come in and build any kind of proper aid project, conduct any proper aid projects other than ones that rely purely on local staff, which obviously can be of some help, but also in the long-term sense, there is no investment in the country. And without foreign outside investment, be it from neighbours or elsewhere, those countries end up just being dependent on aid anyway. So it is a real problem. It's very hard, really, to see how there is going to be any concerted international aid effort into Somalia, or and therefore any kind of aid effort at all that is going to get it out of the current impasse. It's very hard to be optimistic on it.
Many people might say with journalists, a bit like politicians and with lawyers, we could do with a lot less of them rather than a lot more of them. When it comes to Somalia, Mary, I understand in your situation you've been told that the BBC doesn't want you to go back. Take this out of a personal perspective, but how difficult do you think, how many problems do you think that creates for the deep-seated difficulties in Somalia that people like you are not able to go back?
It is a real problem, because as I mentioned before, if we can't go and tell the story and bring pictures back or paint pictures with our words of what's happening in Somalia, then how is the rest of the world even going to care? But at the same time, following the killing of one of my colleagues, Kate Payton, in Somalia a few years ago, the BBC is very, very reluctant to send people. And even though I find it frustrating, I do the way I usually, if I'm going to go to a dangerous country, I usually rely on the local journalists from that country to help me. And in this case, because I'm still trying to go to Somalia and I'm trying to convince people in the BBC to let me go, but I ask my colleagues in the Somali Service and Somali reporters based on the ground, and they all say to me, do not go. You're going to get either killed or kidnapped. So I have to listen to them, but it is very, very frustrating not being able to go at the same time.
I'd like to ask everyone in a while what they think about the problem, if it is a problem of, which it seems it is, of journalists not being able to go to the country in any sort of large numbers to report on the problems there. But Colin, can I ask you, given what happened to you, would you go back?
Probably not at the moment, no. My girlfriend wouldn't wear it for a start, nor would my family, and I think the office would probably want to have a good, long, hard think about sending us specifically back to that place. Other places, it's a different story. Although, I mean, just going back to what we were saying earlier, I mean, Somalia is still, to this day, at the moment, is very well covered in the age of internet and satellite television services by local Somali journalists. I was looking around on the internet for some stuff today, and there are dozens of different reports and reporters based in just about every city doing what is probably often still a very, very dangerous job. Just because they're local people doesn't mean to say they're necessarily any safer. It can actually mean the opposite. And I sometimes wonder, though, whether that is one of the problems these days, is that for Western journalists going to these sort of places, is that there was a time when we were a bit more indispensable, and we were often the only voice that could tell their stories to the outside world, because they didn't have internet and they didn't have satellite television, and they often didn't have very good phone lines. That is no longer the case. And if insurgent groups, for example, or whoever want to tell their stories, they can do. They don't need us anymore. So our sort of passport, our kind of ticket that used to keep us safe in those certain parts of the world is gone.
Mary, what do you think about that? Perhaps not such a loss after all, that it's hard for people like you and me to go there.
And what I find interesting is that somewhere like the BBC, some parts of the BBC they still prefer to hear a voice like mine rather than a Somali voice telling the story. And so what seems to happen in my case quite often is that I will be told the story by these very people you were describing, a fantastic network of Somali journalists who are risking their lives and dying frequently. In fact, we've had several Somali journalists, both working for BBC and other local radio stations, being killed in the last few months. But basically they tell me their story, and then I basically tell the story they told me, but in my voice, because that's the voice that the BBC wants to broadcast. And I don't really agree with that. I would much prefer if it could be a Somali voice telling the story that they've told me. But somehow, the BBC needs to become a bit more broad-minded, I think, in putting more voices from people actually on the ground who come from that country on air.
Can I just put one thing past you there, Mary? One of the problems often is that people who are broadcasting the news, whether it's the BBC, ITN, or it's written in the Sunday Telegraph or wherever, they want to be sure of the veracity of the news they're broadcasting. They want to be sure it's true. Now, you, of course, if you're reproducing someone else's report, can't be sure of that. But neither can editors be when the person perhaps is supplying this copy or this audio, this film, whatever it is. We can't very often check what they're telling us. So doesn't that present a bit of a problem?
Yeah, it definitely presents a problem, because the ideal would be, for me, or whoever's reporting the story to be on the ground, seeing everything with our own eyes. But somewhere like Somalia, when you go, you can't see everything with your own eyes because it's too dangerous. So in fact, quite a lot of the time, you might hear a journalist reporting from Somalia, but they're being told a lot of the news by people sitting in London looking at the news agencies, or people in London making calls to other parts of Somalia to find out what's going on. So in very, very dangerous countries, it's very difficult for journalists to get the big picture. So even though they're on the ground, they don't necessarily really have a very good big picture of the situation. They can just see literally what's going on outside their window.
I know when I was there, I'd been on the ground about 5 hours, and I was getting calls from different parts of the BBC asking me to account for 20, 30 years ago in the history of Somalia, when some junior foreign minister did one thing or another thing. What did I think about it? You can almost instantly become this expert when you really know very, very little at all. And I think, as Mary says, you are thought of because of this. There is a bit of an obsession with somebody being on the spot. Therefore, they must know more than other people, particularly when it's live for some reason. You must know even more because it's live. And I think there is perhaps a bit of a problem there. What do you think about that, Colin?
Well, there's certainly no substitute for going somewhere. I mean, we quite often, on our paper, as on every paper, often the foreign coverage is a joint production, essentially, between somebody like myself based in the office and then a local stringer who will be filing bits of colour, quotes from interviews and so on, and then we roll it into one. Often the local stringer won't have the writing ability to produce a story in house style, but there is never any substitute for going somewhere, even if it is to somewhere like Mogadishu, where quite often you're restricted in your movements. You've got an armed guard with you, and you only go out when it's absolutely necessary. There's no popping out of the hotel for a stroll round in the evening or anything like that. But it just focuses your mind. You get the smell of the place, you sense the chaos of the place. The fear of the place sometimes, and also it makes you read up properly on it, and it really is just no substitute. It makes your pieces much brighter and much more alive than if you're sat several thousand miles away writing about a place that you've never been to before.
How do you think then the fact that with many newspapers and indeed broadcast organisations, there's a growing trend for journalists not to be sent to these places because, of course, it's expensive? And particularly when there's a security problem. And if you look at the foreign pages in many newspapers, they're shrinking almost by the day. They're going right to the back of the paper and seem to play a lesser part in. And in fact, many papers don't even have them. Many tabloid papers don't even have a foreign page. Do you think that is a trend that worries you?
Well, I would certainly be worried if our paper was cutting back enormously on foreign coverage and cutting back on sending people away on a regular basis. I mean, I'm lucky in that it's not happened where I am. Also we're living in an age where one of the byproducts of 9/11 was that what happens in a place like Somalia, or well, let's say Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda were pre-9/11 and where that plot was hatched, broadly speaking, we now know that there is a connect between what goes on in the worst, most lawless parts of the world and what happens on your own doorstep in terms of 9/11 or July 7 or whatever. And that means that there will be an interest always for the foreseeable future in probing these remote parts of the world. And I think for that reason there will always be an interest in sending people to them. I certainly hope so from my point of view anyway.
You mentioned Al-Qaeda there. And there's long been a rumour that Al-Qaeda are sort of entrenched in Somalia with the group Al-Shabab for one. Do you think that's true?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Most people seem to think that the Al-Shabab, who are the group that are commonly identified as having Al-Qaeda leanings in Somalia, there's a slight difference between them and the Al-Qaeda that you might meet in Iraq or Afghanistan, who in those latter cases are quite interested in the idea of the global jihad and sending people back to London to blow themselves up on trains or tubes. The Somali Shabab seem to be a bit more like a local concern, who a bit possibly like the Taliban in Afghanistan have sprung up out of the lawlessness that existed for so long, with all the militias and the civil war and the clan fighting, just simply out of a desire among people to have a bit of stability and not to get robbed or murdered or harassed at a checkpoint left, right and centre. And even if the law and order that they impose is of a very kind of quite a brutal sort, it's considered better than the kind of complete anarchy that was going on before. But it doesn't necessarily extend itself beyond the borders of Somalia itself. It's a fairly local concern. And I was in Mogadishu when the Islamic courts, who had the Al-Shabab sort of as their armed wing, depending on who you listen to, back in 2006. And when it was relatively peaceful, you could wander around the place to parts of Mogadishu that apparently had been off limits to foreigners for years during that brief 6-month period. And most people said that they were broadly fond of the Islamic courts for bringing peace to the area. They had a few complaints about them shutting down cinemas and so on, and banning watching football matches, although for everybody who said that was a complaint, you also heard someone saying, well, the only reason they were shutting the cinemas down was because they were showing porn films, or because they were showing football during the day when the kids should have been at school or whatever. So it was never really quite clear exactly whether their colours were really hardline extremist or not. But on the other hand, people also said, yes, they brought stability, but we didn't really want to live under an Islamist rule long term. So it was great for the stability, but not really good for anything else. So it's hard to really see how long that movement will last, because I'm not sure that there is that appetite for it long term in Somalia. But certainly the idea that they may be an Al-Qaeda proxy, I think, is a little far-fetched.
Mary?
Yeah, I would go along with that. And in fact, I just brought along a quote which was by the spokesman of Al-Shabab, and he was asked this very question recently by Al Jazeera. And he said, "We're not part of Al-Qaeda, but we love them very much." And if you look at their website, for example, on the front page, the first thing you see really is Osama bin Laden and various other sort of almost like shrines to Al-Qaeda. So even though, as you say, I don't think that they even share exactly the same philosophy as Al-Qaeda, they're sort of adopting a lot of the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. And another thing that's happened recently that really does seem to be quite frightening is that basically when the Islamic courts were in control of Mogadishu and other parts of Somalia, the Americans they sort of misread the situation, and they basically said these people had links to Al-Qaeda, they were harboring various people who'd carried out bombings in East Africa, and they almost sort of advertised Somalia as a place for Al-Qaeda sympathizers to be attracted to. And now we do have really very serious reports and really credible reports that there are foreign jihadis in Somalia, people of Pakistani origin, Arabs, people from other African countries, even as far away as Nigeria. And also you have these young Somalis, disaffected Somalis from places like America, Minneapolis especially, who are going back to Somalia to fight jihad, and some of them have become suicide bombers, some of them are dead. So, now Somalia is becoming a more dangerous place in terms of sort of international jihadism than it was before.
I'd like to take a few questions in a minute, but just to wrap up, if we could. It's becoming more dangerous, Mary. What do you think is likely to happen in the coming months and years? Because we have a new government, it's trying to link up with other elements, other more Islamic elements, and people are hoping it'll do better than its predecessor. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, whatever I predict will be wrong, because Somalia is such an extremely unpredictable and eternally surprising place. But I do feel that this new president, who was a very, very senior member of the Islamic courts and who knows the people in Shabab really quite well, he really seems to have lost his way. Shabab have turned against him probably even more viciously than they turned against the former head of state, because they see him as selling out.
Even though he said he wants to have Sharia law now.
Yes, I don't think that's good enough for Al-Shabab, and they really do not like him. And at the moment, he controls just a very tiny part of the capital city, where he's protected by African Union peacekeepers. So my prediction for the current government is really pretty grim, actually. That's my prediction.
Colin, your forecast?
I would say, given the history of other previous attempts to form a government there, which always seem to have fallen into considerable problems, the chances for this next one, just by precedent alone, can't be very good. I would also say, though, that on the issue of whether Al-Qaeda will go there or not, I must say, if I was the commander of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or someone like that, no way would I want to go to Somalia to set up my HQ, because I just think it would be an utter disaster. I think Somalia is too difficult even for Al-Qaeda to operate in. It would just be chaos. And very soon they'd find that all their money had been quietly purloined by someone who had professed allegiance to them or whatever. I'm sure there are genuine supporters there, but I think it would be quite a difficult environment for Al-Qaeda to work in.
Somalia, chaos even for Al-Qaeda. I'd like now to throw it open to the audience, and we've raised so many issues here. Yes.
Right, Tom Fenton, an American journalist. Why do you think the American mainstream media took so long to realize the United States was making a terrible mistake in turning loose the Ethiopians on the Islamic courts, etc.?
Mary, can I ask you then?
And still, a lot of them don't realize what went on, I think.
I think it was the way in which the American government interpreted Somalia, and especially really the Undersecretary of State for African Affairs, Jendai Fraser. She labelled the situation. It was almost like she was kind of milking the fear of the American population post 9/11, and she just very, very quickly linked anything to do with Islam in Somalia with Al-Qaeda. So especially for people in America who don't know very much about the situation in Somalia, except the Black Hawk Down incident, when some of their soldiers were torn apart and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu in the early 1990s, when the Americans had gone there to try to keep the peace and help deliver humanitarian supplies. I think for the American population, they just saw Somalia as a kind of hell on earth, so it fitted into their image of Somalia. And it's now, unfortunately, too late. It's too late, really, because the damage has been done. The damage was done in 2006 when the Ethiopians, with some kind of tacit backing by the Americans, drove out this group of Islamic courts who. It wasn't the most popular thing in the world, but it had worked some kind of magic in some parts of Somalia, because it had created stability. And instead of kind of identifying the strong points of that, they just destroyed it and have now created something much worse in its place.
Of course, now we've got talk of perhaps a UN force being sent in the summer, which I see you smile there. And who can tell whether that'll ever hit the ground? It's certainly having trouble even getting into Darfur very long after it was supposed to arrive, with only half the force there. But we'll have to wait and see on that one. Who else has got it? Over there.
Thanks. Sorry, I come from no reputable journalistic source. I'm from UCL, so probably the academic enemy. It's always hard to formulate questions because there are so many things to ask about Somalia, but the one that springs to mind first is, and I guess I'm reverting to type, you've talked a lot about how much of a basket case Somalia is, and you've talked about the importance of the international community not abandoning Somalia. But surely it's important, therefore, to recognise the things that are not going wrong in Somalia. And yet there's been no mention of Somaliland, and you've talked about Puntland only in terms of your kidnapping, which I accept was a traumatic experience, and I'm not denying that. But in fact, there are many hundreds of foreigners working there. And there are things going right. There are systems that work. Is it not important? Are you not perpetuating the myth by talking about how terrible things are in Mogadishu as if it's Somalia as a whole? isn't it important to look for ways of incorporating news about the other bits of Somalia?
Colin, if I can put that to you, of course, obviously I think there's a bit of trouble in a few more places than Mogadishu in Somalia, but would you like to address that question?
I wouldn't say things are going very well in Puntland, and I don't just mean that from my own experience. You're absolutely right in terms of Somaliland. I haven't been there, but I'm told it's considerably better, and we do occasionally get press releases sent to our office, and I'm sure other offices, from the Somaliland government saying, please help, please recognise that, things are going right in our part of the world. They also want independence, which I understand is problematic for the rest of Somalia. But he's absolutely right, yes, Somaliland is doing well. I think naturally the news media is going to concentrate on the parts of the country that are not going so well. Does that answer your question?
Can I just ask you another supplementary, perhaps, to a little bit of where that was coming from, that question, that perhaps in the media we do tend to dwell on the nastier side of what's happening in the world. I think perhaps not necessarily just in Somalia or in Africa, or, when did you last hear the story about, on the national media, about the happy grocer in Gloucester, for instance? Someone, say, losing their job seems to always be much bigger news than someone gaining their job. But how do you respond to that? Do you think, Colin, we are perhaps a bit obsessed with the bad, particularly in places like Somalia in general, not just Somaliland?
Well, you could talk about, people can talk about sort of positive news values versus negative news values as long as you want. At the end of the day, I don't think news sells newspapers anyway. What sells news? We often get accused of, you only put all that blood and guts and gore on the front page of the paper because it sells newspapers. What sells newspapers is things like, the sport and, other sections of the newspaper. I wish that people, if only they bought newspapers because of what was on the front page or what was on the foreign pages, what I had sweated hard to produce. But I suspect that is not the case. So, which hasn't really answered your question, but it's a very difficult one to get into that. There are many positive things about someone like Somalia. The way they have their own mobile phone service that functions without any. It's a good example of a place where many institutions function on a private basis. Mobile phones, schools to some extent, and so on, without down purely to the entrepreneurial spirit of the people there, which is in contrast to some other parts of Africa to a certain extent. But it would be very hard for us to go to Mogadishu and write purely about that while ignoring everything else that's going on.
Yeah, I think one of the problems I've certainly had I've done a lot of reports from DR Congo, and there we have had people saying, but couldn't you find something cheerful to say at the end of your series, which is so full of awful things? And of course you could do, but the worry there is people will think, oh fine, things are getting better then, they've passed a new law. The fact they've got no one to enforce it, negates that. But you also don't want people walking away thinking, well, things are all right, because in a way a lot of us would like to think that and get on with our lives. But I can see your concern there.
I'm Carolyn Heyman from Peace Direct. I think the positive story is the thing that Congolese people are doing in the Congo and Somalis are doing in Somalia. And you were all incredibly dismissive about the efforts of local Somali organizations. And yet, as someone's just said, Somaliland really got back on its feet entirely by its own efforts, more or less saying to the international community, the things that you want to give us are not the things that we prioritize. So can you just leave us alone to get on with it? We're in touch with Save Somali Women and Children, which is a really strong women's organisation.
So can I just ask you, before you carry on, what you say that the panel, or me, or all of us, dismissed local organisations?
You sort of
like
said,
this.
well...
Which ones, just so we know?
You said, of course there are local organisations, but you kind of implied that without the international organisations, nothing will happen. My sense from talking to Somali organisations is there is lots they could do to deliver aid, but they can't get the UN to give them any resources. So you have this sort of paradoxical situation that the UN's got the money, And goodness knows, you know, we owe Somalia because it wasn't just the US. We were in the Security Council when that resolution was passed. Nobody ever remembers that. So we really owe Somalia, and the UN has resources, but somehow they seem to be unable, and I really don't understand why. So this is my question. Why is it that the UN, which has the resources, can't somehow give the resources to local Somali organizations so they can do the humanitarian work that's so badly needed?
Mary, can I put this to you? And do you think, as I think is being suggested here, that perhaps some of the problem is that people like you and me and maybe Colin don't talk up enough the effort on the ground being done by local organisations, and therefore always want to give the aid to big organisations, particularly foreign ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do bear a responsibility for that. And I mean, the point that was raised earlier about Somaliland is, I mean, I quite often feel that maybe the best answer for Somalia is to be left alone and to see if it can do what Somaliland did. Because, you know, for 20 years now, the so-called international community and the big powers that be have been trying to sort out Somalia, and they have failed. But then at the same time, if, you know, I wish someone from the United Nations was here to answer your question about, about why, you know, more work can't be done with local organisations, because it is certainly true that there are lots and lots of very brave, very active local organisations in Somalia. And I mean, one thing I will say in defence of the BBC is that the BBC Somali Service covers their stories all the time, and they don't just talk about the bad things in Somalia.
Just before, was there someone from the UN? Was I told? No, doesn't want to speak. Can I speak to the gentleman here who understand? I get the impression has strong links with Somaliland.
Yes, no, I'm from Somalia, and I'm from Somaliland, and both from Somalia. You like to divide Somalis; they are the same people anyway. I just came back from Mogadishu in February. I stayed 4 weeks in Mogadishu, and I'm going next Sunday to Mogadishu. It's not the way you are telling the situation in Somalia, and I think it's much better than what the reporters are reporting, because usually they get second-hand information, and always the bad news is sensational.
What is the good news?
The good news, I'll tell you. We, Somali diaspora, send $1 billion a year. That means without servicing the World Bank interest and IMF, free of charge, 1 billion. Is there any African countries that the World Bank gives or International Monetary Fund gives to an African country? No. No interest, no servicing of debts. So we send 1 billion. That's when we are supporting our families, only sending $100, $200. When it became a peaceful through the Islamic courts, 6 months, Somali diaspora wanted to invest the country, and we didn't need money from international community. We didn't need any help. But the international community sent Ethiopians and destroyed our peace. It was the money, it was taxpayers' money that destroyed the peace of Somalia at that time. They displaced 1,800,000 people. They killed 13,000 people. No journalists speak about it because in Western journalism, they don't want to mention that. They don't want to complain about Ethiopia. They don't want to say anything about atrocities. So Americans were complicit, British were complicit with that, and they don't want to speak about it.
When you say people were complicit, do you mean journalists, governments, politicians, who or all? Or
yes, because the way some news that you talk about, for example, Darfur, you talk about Darfur, how many people died in Darfur? And how many people died in Mogadishu in 3 months, less than 3 months? How many people are displaced in Mogadishu, and half a city has been destroyed? No one speaks about it. I think it will be much better if international community leave alone Somalia. We don't need their aids. We don't need their support. It's enough for us. We can support ourselves. We developed communication. Somalia is one of the best in Africa that you can call any village in Somalia. My mobile, I can call any village in Somalia right now. There's a private schools. There's when the government was there, there was 1 university. Right now, there's 7 universities in Mogadishu, owned by private companies.
But can I just ask you, the point you're making is you think that the outside world should not be giving aids to local organisations or big organisations or any organisations. They should leave Somalia alone.
They are giving their money to some people, sharks, who are situated in Nairobi, and they spend, you know,
So they're giving to the wrong people.
they're giving to wrong people. They never give local organizations because they trust the color of their people, and they don't trust the other work that the local organizations do. So it's much better for us to leave us so we can depend ourselves, we can support our families, we can support our country, but give us a peace. Don't send mercenaries to our country, because you send mercenaries, people who don't care if they die, people who don't care the people that they're killing. And I think that's what the international community did. And what we did ourselves, we built 17 years without any government. We built our country. Mogadishu was one of the best, but you destroyed less in 2 years' time. Right now, the question will be, why the journalists? I'm going coming Sunday. If you want to come with me, I'll protect you. Believe me.
Just some other people to talk to. You seem to be saying, is it you destroyed? Sorry, who destroyed?
The money that you sent to Ethiopian
No,
troops.
who's you?
The West.
The West.
Yes. The Security Council. That's
Security
right.
Council.
The Americans. Yes. They destroyed the country. They killed the people. That's exactly what happened.
Thank you.
I'm going to now. The question will be, why can't you tell the good news in Somalia right now? Since the new president came in, there's no fighting in Mogadishu. Why don't you mention it? It was very rarely to hear.
So there's no fighting in Mogadishu.
There's no fighting in Mogadishu. Yes, it's
Colin,
a peaceful. So why can't you tell that?
Sorry, thank you very much for your point, Colin. Would you like to answer? It seems. I mean, we've had reports today of 30 people killed and 50 injured. I'm not sure. It's about 200 kilometers, 200 miles rather, northwest of Mogadishu. Not in Mogadishu. Colin, indeed you did. So, Colin, do you feel that we're not reporting enough of the good news? And if we take the example here, say Mogadishu, which has always been a place people have labelled as the sort of the violent centre of Somalia, why is it we're not perhaps picking up on some of the better news?
I think people would probably want to wait and just see how things pan out. It's not long since the new president came to power, relatively speaking, and certainly I would love to go in a year's time if it's nice and peaceful. I'll come with you maybe if the office lets me, and we can say, look, at this place, it's a year or two it was a terrible terrible city of bloodshed. Now everything's is turned around. I mean, that was 2 years ago. That was the story I did when the Islamic courts were there, was the way that they had turned the place around. And you're absolutely right to say that after the Ethiopians came in, things went back to the bad old ways. And we've done similar stories in places like Baghdad, where we do go back and we report when things have got better. But I think for the particular time being, it will be a case of wait and see, and let's see how Mogadishu fares, and of course the rest of the country.
And good luck on Sunday. Sorry, yes.
Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Mohammed Amin, and I'm a freelance journalist, originally from Somalia. Sorry to hear Mr. Colin Freeman that you were kidnapped in Bosaso, Somalia. And a lot of Somali people, vast majority of Somali people, were praying for your release and safety, and I'm glad to see you here. And the second thing is we know that there are a lot of journalists that are killed on a daily basis in war-torn countries or where the problems exist, like Afghanistan, Iraq, DRC, Darfur. Somalia is one of them. So if you say, I'm not willing to go back to Somalia, or if Mary said, okay, BBC is not allowing me to go there, who will broadcast the problem is going on in Somalia? Because of only this week, over 100 people, Somali people, were killed in central and southern Somalia. And a lot of people don't aware of that. But you just mentioned 3 aid workers were kidnapped in southern Somalia today. So who is responsible for these kind of things? And the second thing is Ethiopians were responsible for massacring thousands of Somali people. It was a proxy war. A lot of Somali people do not see that Ethiopians killed them, but they believe Americans were behind this, especially Bush administration. Over 250,000 Somali people were killed, and we did not see the front pages, or we did not see the coverage for the British newspapers or British radios or TVs, this kind of atrocities. So why these kind of things are always going to happen? And why do we always mention the negative side instead of the positive side? A lot of good things going on in Somalia. Somaliland is part of them. It's very peaceful. Puntland is relatively peaceful, we can say, compared to southern Somalia. Why we don't say anything about the new elected president, who is a modern Islam And also, the other thing is 6 months when the Islamic courts were ruling in Mogadishu, Somalia. We did not see these kind of things, but we always try to mention the negative things like piracy, killings, kidnapping, these kind of things. Why these kind of things are going on?
Thank you. Well, that's a point that we were dealing with just now about the negativity, which in fact we've had from two people here tonight. But Mary, the other point being made there was if international journalists are reluctant to go in, or in your case, you're not allowed to go in, it's going to be a case, presumably, of relying on something Colin's mentioned too, on local journalists. Now, I would have thought too, perhaps people here might also feel that local journalists can do a very good job as well. So is it safe leaving it to them?
Well, I mean, every single day, that's what I do now, is the way that I cover Somalia every single day I'm at work. I would say almost every day I will write a story about Somalia. So things like what's going on in El Bor with people being killed, that is reported by the BBC World Service. It's probably not heard by very many people in England, but you know, the international part of the BBC is trying to tell this story of Somalia. But you know, the only way that I can tell the story is by speaking to the people on the ground. But one thing that is good, you know, you mentioned that the telephone system is fantastic. So, you know, the moment you dial the number, you'll get through to the governor or the local reporter on the ground. So you can speak to lots of different people, and then from your own experience, my experience of having gone there, so I can picture the country, even though I can't be there right now, I do feel that I can, you know, to the best of my ability, try to give a sort of well-rounded picture of what's going on in Somalia. It's imperfect, but I think it's better than doing nothing. You know, what else are people like me supposed to do? Am I just supposed to ignore Somalia because I can't go there?
Thank you very much. And can we take the question over here?
Good evening. Actually, my question is how much does like BBC or other institutions feel like they have some responsibility to train Somali people in the UK to work, because I think we need more raggers, people who can assess the country and at the same time be safe. Because I think I don't quite agree with you that you said about Al-Qaeda. It's not that problematic. I'm from Somaliland, and in October they just killed 22 Somalilanders without no reasons. So I do think we have really a problem now with Islamic extremists in Somalia. And they are also trying to inspire those who are in Somaliland. So even Somaliland, places where it's safe. And I wouldn't call Somaliland good news, but it's a country that is really trying their best. And it's a news in a sense how many East African countries have elections after elections after elections in 5 years. So it's not good news, but it's a news in a complex horror situation where Eritrea is the most one of the horrible dictatorship now in the region. You got Minister Sharmarke, who is also, I don't know what to call him, who's killing even his neighbors after his own people. And so I don't know, I feel we need to train journalists from journal origin, because you can always tell who the journalists have spoken to. Even with the BBC, I can exactly tell which clan they were, because I don't think you can trust just local people, because they are also part of that bigger conflict. So, for example, my brother, he said, the new president is good. So if you interview other people, they will have different opinion. So, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps, Mary, on that one, I know that the BBC, I think it's the World Service Trust, and the BBC Trust, does do quite a lot of this sort of work in different countries. I don't know if it's doing that in Somalia, training up journalists, is it?
It does train journalists in Somaliland, so I do think it's, you know, it is trying, but it would be difficult for it to do it in Somalia at the moment, because it's, well, a lot of it is too dangerous. So it is, you know, it is trying. It does have courses in Somaliland, definitely.
And Colin, the other point that was being made by the lady there was this question of trusting your sources, something we did mention a little bit earlier on. When you're relying on people locally, and Mary's been singing their praises, you've mentioned that you do use them on a regular basis. presumably there is always a problem that you don't know which side of the fence, if any necessarily, these people are on, and you can't really check their information, and yet it's forming quite a large part of a news report that you're writing.
Well, that's always going to be the same with any foreign reporting where you, as a Westerner, go to another country. I mean, I was speaking to some Somalis a couple of weeks ago asking them what it was like to be brought up here in the UK, having spent their formative first 15 years of their lives in Mogadishu. And they said the first thing, the overwhelming thing they felt is it's like being deaf. You don't speak the language in London, you don't speak English, you don't really know what's going on around you. Unless you speak Somali as a British journalist, yes, of course, your perception of what is going on is always going to be limited. And most of the time when you're in somewhere like Mogadishu, the fixers and translators you use tend to be journalists themselves. So, yeah, there is always a limit to the accuracy of the information you're going to get. All you can hope to do is create a kind of broad brush, and you obviously have to exercise a degree of caution in terms of trying to verify and cross-check what one person says to you to make sure that it's representative. It's a difficult task though, and you will always, it's always going to be down to the art of the possible.
Gentleman over there.
Hi, thank you for your informative talk. I'm a psychiatrist, I'm not a journalist. I'm involved in UCL as well with anthropology. And my patch includes Camden, so I've got quite a few young Somali patients. And I just wanted to ask, what kind of experience did they have growing up in Somalia? I mean, most of them are in their 20s now. They came when about 10 years old. And the other question was, what kind of mental health services did they experience when they were there? And my other question is, you mentioned that the Somalia has been under severe Islamic law or something like that. In what way, I mean, what exactly is that? And in what way is that different from other countries that we do have a lot of dealings with? For example, Saudi Arabia, how does that differ?
Yeah, how different would you say the Islamic courts are in terms of the type of rule that imposed on people in Somalia compared to, say, the regime in Saudi Arabia?
The Islamic courts, first of all, we need to kind of differentiate between the Islamic courts and Al-Shabab, who are now imposing sort of a slightly different form of Islamic authority on quite a lot of Somalia. I mean, I think Somalia is very, very unique, as all countries are, but Somalia is kind of particularly unique in that everybody speaks the same language, which is unusual for Africa. Almost everybody is a Muslim, and there's a very kind of strong Somali culture or identity. But in terms of the kind of Islamic law they were imposing, imposing Sharia law. They were, as you mentioned, doing... Which means, just to spell out to people who aren't aware. Yeah, I mean, things like, punishments would be different than Western law. For example, amputation, sometimes stoning, things like that are used. They were also doing things like not allowing people to chew cat, which is a sort of mild stimulant that lots of Somalis chew. They were closing down cinemas and things like that. And now we've also got Al-Shabab, which is doing things like on public transport, men have to sit at the front, women at the back. There's lots of different sort of ways that they oblige people to change their behaviour. But it does, compared to Saudi Arabia? Yeah, I mean, it's not as kind of entrenched or as widespread as in Saudi Arabia. And Somalia hasn't become like a Saudi Arabia in Africa. It's still Somalia. So you're saying it's a milder type of Islamic law than in Saudi Arabia, even under Islamic courts or under the current government? Yeah, it's different. I don't think you can sort of export the situation in Saudi Arabia to Somalia.
I think the big selling point was that it was law of a sort, when previously there had been none, and they were getting rid of some of the checkpoints that were taxing people or murdering people, or and just imposing a degree of basic police security, and then the the Islamic nature of it, one way or the other, was slightly secondary in terms of how it was popular amongst people and how it caught the imagination of people to a certain extent.
Another thing that we were asked in that question was about mental health services. Were you aware when you were there of what existed in this sort of area, or if you're not, I'll pass it over to Mary.
I'm not. You were asking about what sort of conditions people grew up in that have come over here. A lot of them seem to have grown up in refugee camps, often outside of Somalia, which often seems to have been pretty grim. I would imagine the access to mental health facilities was pretty zero. Well, the gentleman here probably knows more than I do, and he's nodding his head when I say zero.
Right, we've got about 5 minutes. Can we take a couple of questions? Take over there.
Hi. My question concerns the various international interventions that have happened in Somalia in the early 90s, the failed UN mission in Somalia, and more recently in 2006, which has only exacerbated the problems that Somalis face. And but at the same time, this new president, he will need the support of the international community, diplomatically, financially, because at the moment the pirates have more money than him. My question is, what lessons can the international community learn? Because I mean, they have created so many of the problems, past and present, in Somalia. I mean, certainly Somalia is beset with problems within, but they've just exacerbated the problems that we've had. But then at the same time, this new president is not going to, like, the way everything just ended at the, this is like a complete basket case, and none of you were very optimistic about it. But at the same time, if you had to give Obama some advice about how to approach, how would that? Because what lessons can the international community learn when approaching Somalia?
Mary.
I think the first lesson that the international community should learn, given its past rather sort of fatal disasters, is not to think that it knows better than the Somalis. But at the same time, I think the international community has to be aware that quite a lot of Somalis are very, very adept at using and abusing it, especially for money. For example, there's been about 15 peace conferences in the last 19 years to sort out Somalia. Some of these have dragged on for years, and they're very, very expensive. Europe and the United States in particular have handed out millions of dollars to keep, hundreds of Somalis in hotels in Nairobi for months on end. So I think the international community has to get a bit wise to this. And the current UN Special Envoy to Somalia, Ahmed Ould Abdallah from Mauritania, has got wise to this. And he said, look, all these peace conferences have got to be smaller. He gives them a deadline of days rather than weeks, months or years. So I think both sides have to kind of get wise to each other. I think really that's the only way forward. But really, the responsibility does lie with the Somalis, but the international community has got to accept that it has played a huge part in actually destroying the small chances that Somalia had to become something more like its northern neighbour, Somaliland.
Yes, I would have said there that the way the question came that the outside world has done a lot of damage, may well be, but I think it would be patronising to Somalis to suggest that the outside world's totally to blame, and that the outside world is the only, or are the only countries that need to learn, presumably everyone, including, as you said there, Mary, Somalis. Exacerbated it. Okay, thank you. And one last question, somebody hasn't spoken? Can I just take a question, because afterwards everyone can comment to each other, but just take with this. We've only got a couple of minutes.
I'm a student. I was just wondering, Colin, something I've always wondered about people that get kidnapped and there's no language in common, if you can kind of use your eyes as a defence to sort of build a rapport with your kidnappers, or if that's just naive.
Use your eyes?
Yeah, to sort of to look at them and to appeal to them, to remind them that you're a human being and Did you consciously try to cultivate an I relationship?
We tried talking to them as much as was possible, which wasn't a great deal because we didn't have much of a much language in common. But yes, you do try and talk to them, or you gesture at them. It's a bit like playing charades or something. You a bit of guesswork and a bit of chat, and you eventually move to some sort of understanding. And we think that helped. Can't be certain. At the end of the day, they didn't kill us, but it helps you. We would have odd occasions where we'd sort of spend a morning teaching each other. We would teach them a bit of English. They would teach us a bit of Somali, and it just to have a bit of civilized, sort of friendly conversation certainly helped the day go a bit. But what they were really thinking, I've no idea.
Can we take just one last question? Can we take the lady there?
Chinotsu Baba, Japanese journalist. Can I ask to Mary quickly about political situation? You said your prediction about the political situation is grim. Can you elaborate a little bit more about this? Can you think what is a scenario for the near future, perhaps best and worst?
Yeah, I think the new president does face a really difficult situation because, as I said earlier, he's seen as a sellout by the people who probably are at the moment the most dangerous people in Somalia, which is Al-Shabab, and they really seem to be quite steadfast in their decision to reject him. But then again, at the same time, because he and they came from the same movement, there is a possibility, because he knows who they are, even though they're very, very secretive people and it's very difficult to speak to them or to know how they operate. There is a possibility that if he can convince them that some kind of dialogue and some kind of compromise might be worth it, at least he knows them, he understands them, and they know him. But at the moment, it really doesn't look like that is going to happen. It looks like he is basically only able to function in areas which are protected by the African Union. And in fact, it's interesting that pretty much the first thing he's done since he's come to power is go on this tour of the countries like Burundi, which provides troops for him. So it seems to be his priority, is kind of getting support from his neighbours rather than concentrating on the problems at home. So I don't think that his approach is really satisfying quite a lot of people in Somalia. I'm sorry that it's such a sad prediction, and I might be wrong.
And Colin, can I ask you what your forecast is for this? Because we've got talk of the UN maybe coming back in the summer, and at least there are going to be discussions then on whether perhaps the UN force should be sent. Do you think the outside world is going to once more really engage with Somalia?
I'm not an expert on the past history of foreign aid intervention in Somalia, or really the interventions by foreign troops and so on. But I mean, in terms of what are going to be the priorities for Barack Obama, he has already publicly stated that Afghanistan is his main priority, as I understand it. I think that the appetite within the Western world for further very interventionist interventions in places like that is probably limited. And from some of the comments we've heard this evening, also there seems to be quite a lot of enthusiasm for having some kind of organic, homegrown solution to the problems, which I think would probably be the best long-term thing. Although, things like the TFG, the transitional federal government, that was supposed to be of that sort in itself. So just how successful that will be either remains to be seen, which is sitting on the fence really as ever.
Colin Freeman, Mary Harper, and everyone tonight, thank you very much indeed for coming.